There are 5 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as a participant. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
For FEMA Region 2. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the Region 2 website in the coming days. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure your volume is turned up so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right corner, we ask if you'd like to receive news and updates from Region 2, and if so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You'll see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter there, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation will be made available for you to download at the end of the presentation as a PDF, and you can click on the file and download it using the download button. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Debbie Costa, the Preparedness Specialist with Region 2, to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I'm Debbie Costa, the Preparedness Liaison on the New Jersey FEMA Integration Team. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, I'm so happy to welcome you to our Preparedness and Resilience webinar series. As part of FEMA's 2018 to 2022 strategic plan, our goal 1 is to build a culture of preparedness. Our division is focused on helping people prepare for disasters, which includes helping to build more resilient communities. As part of that goal, we're pleased to be hosting this webinar that will focus on identifying community assets and resources and how they can be used to meet community needs and to strengthen the community as a whole. Our guest speaker today is Keith Adams. He is the Executive Director of NJ VOAD. From 2014 through 2018, Keith served as the organization's chairperson. The organization's mission is focused on building disaster-resilient communities throughout New Jersey. NJ VOAD improves outcomes for people and communities affected by disasters by facilitating cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration among nonprofit organizations, community-based groups, government agencies, and for-profit companies. He has served as subject matter expert resource to state and VOAD recovery leadership throughout the United States. With that, Keith, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Allison, and thank all of you for being here this afternoon or morning, depending upon where you're coming from. So just a little bit about New Jersey VOAD, where I serve as Executive Director. We're the New Jersey affiliate of National VOAD, the recognized non-governmental leader of the disaster preparedness, response, and recovery sector. We're the only disaster network in New Jersey that links and harnesses both the power of voluntary organizations and government. Our VOAD members and partners represent a powerful force of goodwill in both our local communities here in New Jersey and across the United States. Through our network, we provide the leadership that makes our communities stronger and more resilient, that in times of disaster delivers hope for a more positive future. So today I'm here to talk a little bit about using asset-based community development principles to build disaster-resilient communities. This is what we use here in New Jersey. And my presentation, for those of you who are grew up with Sesame Street or had children who did, is you'll remember the song, "Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood?" And I think that this is a great theme for us to use for this presentation. But first, a little bit about how we look at disasters and why resilience is important. So our old definition of disaster looks something like this: a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society and causes human, material, and economic or environmental losses that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope using its own resources. And most of you, this is familiar to you. We use this in what I used to call the response piece, where we kind of parachuted in as superheroes into communities that had disasters and took our organization's blueprint, if you will, and started to organize the community in a top-down way around our blueprint. But as we started to look at the idea that disasters begin and end locally, and started to adopt the idea of whole community recovery, it became obvious that what was happening is that what we really needed to do was we needed to focus in a new way to engage community organizations and build relationships and engage them in their own recovery. And where we used this model, we found that most communities recovered faster and better. So that required a little tweak to our disaster definition. So now you can see it's about something that disrupts the functioning of an individual, household, community, or society, and that exceed the individual, household, community, or society's ability to cope using its own resources. What practically means for us is that we actually are engaging a whole different group in the community. So organizations that focus on hunger, poverty, underemployment, housing, security, all those kind of community organizations now, we can say that they have a role to play in disaster. So basically it's a way to build those relationships and knit that community together in a stronger way to respond to these kind of smaller, more localized disasters, and then we can also use that to kind of ramp up for a community-wide disaster or a region disaster, or in this case, a national or worldwide disaster here in this pandemic. Now, along with this, we also have a lot of disaster myths, and I'm sure that you're familiar with many of them. One is that, things return to normal after a few weeks. And the facts are, as we know, disasters have enduring effects and major economic consequences. Here in New Jersey, we're still recovering from Sandy. We're coming up on our 8th anniversary of that. We have at least 1,500 households that we know that we're still working with, or our partners are working with on a daily basis to try to affect their recovery. Disasters bring out the worst in people. Well, we've seen this on the news. While there are isolated cases of antisocial behavior, which tend to be highlighted by the media, most people respond positively and generously. And we're seeing that, of course, in this current disaster of the pandemic. The affected population is too shocked and helpless to take responsibility for its own survival. Well, the fact is that many people find new strength and resiliency during a disaster that occurs in their community. And it's important that we recognize this as we adopt the whole community recovery model, and that is that we have to make sure that we're giving agency. And a good way to give people agency in a disaster is to have relationships with them and those organizations that are serving on the front lines prior to that disaster, and that's kind of the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And of course, disasters are random killers. Well, we know that disasters strike the most vulnerable groups the hardest. When the big wind comes, we all experience the wind. We've heard several times in this particular disaster, we're all in the same boat. Just some of us are in yachts and some of us are in dinghies. So the truth is that the effects that a disaster has on a community are going to hit the most vulnerable groups hardest. We've seen that in the current pandemic, those who were food insecure, those who were economically insecure, our seniors, our disabled and access and functional needs folks certainly have been hit harder than most. So community resilience, which is what we're trying to work to build and look at one tool to do that today, is the sustainability of the community to use the available resources, whether they be energy, communication, transportation, etc., to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. So that could be anywhere from a pandemic, what we're experiencing now, or to some kind of economic collapse, which actually we're experiencing that as well. And then, of course, why should individuals be resilient? Well, the community resilience is really built out of individual resilience. because healthy, socially connected, prepared people make for stronger communities that are better able to withstand, manage, and recover from disasters. See if we can get this slide to advance. There we go. So our dilemma and what we're going to look at today, and that is that people and communities have deficiency in needs. So we know this, right? We're primarily focused on looking at needs. And then the other half of the glass is that individuals and communities have assets and capacities. So this is the people power, the power of communities, the resources that they have, and we often overlook them. So today, hopefully what we're going to do is look at that half full and see how that perhaps we can start to discover the assets that individuals and communities have and how they can be connected together to build community resilience. So what we're going to talk about today is a thing called asset-based community development. Now, it's been around since the early 80s, but of course, like I like to say, it's really just common sense. So it's been around for a while, albeit sometimes in short supply. You can get an advanced degree from it from Northwestern University if you give them a boatload of cash. And by the way, if you do have a degree in asset-based community development, I'm going to make you the presenter and I'll log off. And I don't see anybody coming up in the chat box that says they're volunteering to take over, so I guess it's on me. So what I'd really like to do, normally at this point in my presentation, it's a video, but our platform today does not allow that. So my friends at City Life, which is a community development agency, actually put together this video. And I'm going to try to duplicate that a little bit through my artwork here on the PowerPoint presentation today. But it's a story about Charlie. And there you see him on the screen. That's my friend. And hopefully he's going to have you up to speed at least on some basic ideas of what using asset-based community development is all about. So this is Charlie. Charlie has a career, has experienced a measure of success, a house that he calls home, a family he loves, and he's part of a community of people who are much like Charlie and his family. Because Charlie is part of a faith-based community, he naturally has a heart for people. At some point in Charlie's life, he became inspired to step out and help those who seemed stuck by their circumstances, to get out of their circumstances and also experience some measure of success. So that's what Charlie did. He stepped out and began caring for people by doing community service. After a while of doing community service to the poor in his community, Charlie realized something. Charlie realized that he and his community were in a city. Look out at the So what Charlie realized that often that the middle class members of his community look out at the under-resourced people in the city and think to themselves, these people are broken. They make poor choices and they're poor. And then he and those that are like him do community service relating to their neighbors based on their neighbors' brokenness and poverty. At some point in that relationship, the under-resourced neighbors react to the attitude of Charlie's community and look back at the middle class and think to themselves, hey, these people are broken too. They're hypocritical and they don't understand. They have their own kind of poverty. But what Charlie and his community learned to do was instead of seeing people as broken, poor, and impoverished, they decided instead to look for gifts and strengths. Then instead of community service, engagement, participation, or care, Charlie just decided to just be community with his under-resourced neighbors. What happened was that the under-resourced no longer saw Charlie and his friends as broken and hypocritical or demeaning. What they saw were friends who were compassionate. From that point, the under-resourced neighbors in Charlie's communities were friends who were willing to accept each other's weaknesses because they appreciated their strengths and friendships so much more. Charlie and his community decided to be part of the informal network of friendships with all their neighbors. What happened was that the middle-class community and the low-income neighbors of Charlie helped address each other's poverty through meaningful relationships. Together, they were able to build a better and more resilient community for all. Isn't this a better picture of a resilient community? So, some of the basic tenets of an asset-based approach to disaster resilience, okay, is that individuals, groups, and communities have all the assets or gifts, if you will, to address their needs. However, they might not have all the resources. Now, what are gifts or assets? Well, there are interests, motivations, styles, bodies, values, passions, hopes, dreams, and life journeys. These are all of our assets. The second piece about this is that there's no hierarchy of gifts. So everybody's gifts have value, none more or less than another. Our gifts and assets are not only supplement each other. Sorry, folks, having a little trouble with the slides here. There we go. So our gifts and assets not only supplement each other, but multiply. We exist in a particular context. So New Jersey's not Iowa. Des Moines is not Newark, nor for that matter Margate, although there's an elephant named Lucy there. Our assets and gifts function differently depending upon the context that we are in. So what do we normally do when we're assessing a community? Well, normally what we do is this needs-based approach, right? We start looking for problems. And often we go in, and again, as an external organization or as a subject matter expert, and we assess communities. So we start looking around for what the problems are. And then from there, through that needs-based lens, we only see what we want to see. So the expert or consultant that you hire builds some kind of detailed image of deprivation and social breakdown in the community. And these images often become a starting point, and a starting point for often a program in response to what the perceived needs are. Oftentimes, local folks may only be kind of tangibly involved in determining what the problems are, but often they're not involved at all and their voices are not heard. So our disposition is to view our neighborhood through this needs-based lens. So, this is an example, okay, of perhaps an asset map. Well, it's not an asset map, but a needs-based mapping thing where we start to look around a community and we start to put down on paper and say, well, this neighborhood is known for this. This is the big problem here. And again, this leads us to build programs to address those problems. But there's some significant consequences of this particular method, some of which I think that you're going to be well aware of. First of all, the expert's shape, or that plan, shapes the perception. So it determines targets and kind of pre-designed solutions. We build these programs with a focus on fixing people. And of course, if we're fixing people, then the obvious takeaway from that is that, they're broken. So when we focus on fixing people, in essence, we are either doubling down on their own self-image of being broken, or we're telling them they're broken. Often these programs develop a client mentality. So people may come to believe that they're incapable of taking charge of their own lives and futures, that they are dependent instead of strong. And the last thing I think that's most important is most of us are involved in these things to achieve some kind of sustainable transformation in communities. And these kind of approaches often fail to achieve that. So we come in, we fix the broken folks that we think need fixing, and then the program's over and we all go home, and the community is still broken. So that's not sustainable transformation. So let's contrast this with an asset-based focus on community strengths and resources. So first of all, we're going to start with building a positive image. We're going to start with individuals and organizations and discern assets and capacities that are already present in the community. This process builds an image of strength and resources. And then, of course, the last piece of this is that it's not enough just to know where these assets are and resources. It's about putting them together, right? So connected assets mobilize to build up and strengthen the life of the community. And we're going to talk about connectors in a bit. So these two approaches kind of look the same on the surface, but when you dive down, it really is about the methodology that you're using, what approach that you're coming from. So we see, okay, in our needs-based, generally we're using words like control. We're focusing on production goods and services. We're talking about clients and consumers, and we're focused very much on need. Whereas an asset-based approach focuses on choice for the people that are involved. We talk about care. We talk about citizens, and we talk about capacity. ABCD is about individuals, organizations, and communities believing in their potential. So, sustainable change. Well, the big red R, with apologies to Rutgers, but of course, being from New Jersey, I have to shout out for our state university. But in this case, it stands for relationships. So this is really what this is about, is forming sustainable, good relationships. Okay, so it's about individuals being committed to investing their resources and assets and then connecting in relationship. And this multiplies the power and effectiveness and results in sustainable change. So I think in the old days, we used to call this buy-in. So again, the key is locating all the assets and then begin connecting them in ways that multiply their power and effectiveness. So the act of discovering, identifying, and connecting people's assets changes the way that individuals view themselves and those around them. So instead of seeing themselves,
are the people in your neighborhood?
Instead of seeing themselves as needy or deprived, they begin to believe in their own
Say,
potential.
who are the people in your neighborhood? The people that you meet each day. Oh, hi there, little fella.
Oh.
Hey, listen, you know who you could be if I gave you this little hat and a bag to carry over your shoulder?
Well, that could be a laundryman.
No, not a laundry.
How about Santa Claus?
No, not Santa Claus.
What's wrong with Santa Claus?
There's nothing wrong with Santa Claus.
Don't you like Christmas?
Oh, I love Christmas, but you could be the postman.
A postman? Oh, the postman always brings the mail. Through rain or snow or sleet or
so lots of people
hail.
at this point
I'll
say,
work and work the whole day through
is there,
to get your letter safe
some research
to you.
stuff. Yeah,
Cause the postman
40
is
years
a
of-
person in
yeah.
your neighborhood.
In your neighborhood.
He's in your neighborhood.
A postman is
Yeah,
a person
it's
in your
clear
neighborhood.
that I can't get
A
off.
person that you meet each day.
So is it, which slide do you need to be on? This one? I could advance the slide.
Actually, go back.
Well, apparently.
Can't go back. Okay, we'll just leave it here and I'll catch up. Oops.
Okay, let me see if the music is still playing though, because that's what people are hearing. Okay, sounds like the music is done. We're good to go.
Okay, we just need to go back a few slides, which I can't seem to do now, Deb. So that's forward. We need to go back.
How's that?
Keep going. One more.
I'm trying. Allison, you want to give it a whirl?
If you can't, then we'll just go forward one slide and I'll catch up. There we go. Just there we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Oh, who are the people in your neighborhood? In your neighborhood, in your neighborhood. Say, who are the people in your neighborhood?
Yeah,
The people that you meet each day. Oh, hi there, little fella.
Hello.
Hey, listen, you know who you could be if I gave you this little hat and a bag to carry over
Fine,
your
yeah,
shoulder?
That could be a laundryman.
One ahead. Perfect. Okay, folks, hopefully there's no music playing now, and I apologize. And now we're 2 slides ahead. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the research findings, and that is that in every story that we looked at where these principles have been used, that the neighbors know about where the local assets are. Successful neighborhood action has been a result of the assets that were not connected and then were connected. And to connect individual assets, there's got to be a connector, which is an individual association or local institution. Okay, let's see if we can get to the right slide because they scrolled ahead on us. So the music that you heard this is actually taken from an in-person presentation. And normally it's the time when I actually, sometime in that, ask people to stand up and talk a little bit about, or we sing the Sesame Street song, which, hopefully kind of focuses on the whole idea of who are the people in your neighborhood. But I apologize that was in there and caused us some problems. So there are many tools in the ABCD toolbox. They include intentional listening, survey and data gathering, and also can include charrettes and more. Allison, I'm not sure what's happening, but the slides seem to be advancing on their own.
On their own.
Yeah. I think it's a delayed reaction, so if we're clicking too much, it's just going forward, but I'm trying to work on it. Give me just a second.
Okay.
So, Keith, while we're waiting for the slides to catch up with you, I was reading some of the comments, and there seemed to be some questions or concerns about the story that you told, if it was a church community that you were talking about, or, if it was maybe, I don't know, some people kind of took it kind of negatively as a bad way.
Okay, so yeah, the particular story that was talking about, Charlie. So yes, Charlie was, and I actually saw a comment, and I want to address that, is Charlie was motivated by faith to reach out and do community service. But of course we know that faith is not the only motivator for folks, going out and doing community service. There are lots of different motivations. In that particular story, that was his motivation. So it wasn't implying that that's the only motivation that folks have. So if it was taken that way, shouldn't be.
Thank you.
I also see some other questions about cultural nuances and biases. And cultural nuances and biases are definitely a problem, especially in needs-based approach when the community is not engaged. So oftentimes, that's one of the problems with outside experts that come in or organizations that come in that are not a part of the community, that folks can look at that and because of their particular bias or their perspectives, can see things differently than local folks. That's why I think it's really important to use asset-based principles where you're actually going out and engaging the community in that process, where they're self-identifying their assets and they're self-identifying how those relationships come together.
Thank you. Is this the slide that you were hoping that we would end up on?
Well, I'm hoping we're going to come back to one more. There we go. So, folks, again, I apologize for the slides gone wild. We actually checked this out before the presentation, and everything was fine, but hopefully we can pick up where we left off. So as we talk about the tools that are available for us for asset-based community development, and there are a lot of different tools, and asset mapping is only one piece of this. So those tools typically include intentional listening, survey and data gathering, charrettes. Charrettes are a self-directed meeting, which we've used very successfully, and there's lots more. And remember, you can get an advanced degree, just not today. That's not what we're here for. So asset mapping is one tool that can be used as a starting point to discover and connect assets in a community. So let's start by developing our own personal asset map. Then we'll see how it can be used to build a more resilient community. So this is kind of the participation point. Don't need to be doing this you know, in the chat box or anything else, but if you happen to be in front of a piece of paper or and have a pencil or a pen, just begin by writing down a few of your own personal assets. So, you know, what are those personal assets? Remember, these include your interests, your motivations, styles, body, values, passions, hopes, and dreams, as well as your life experiences. So I know that you're all very gifted and talented folks, so let's try to capture at least 3 of those things. So great, do you have at least 3 down? Okay, so let's move on to listing at least 3 groups that you belong to. Maybe it's the PTA or a community association. Maybe it's a faith community. Maybe it's a service club like the Rotary or the Lions. Okay, so hopefully you've got 3 either written down or in your head. Now think at least about 3 places that you regularly visit. So maybe that's the library or the CVS or the local Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, any of those kind of places. Okay, so if you've captured your, assets, at least 3 of them, and 3 of your groups and 3 of your places, then you have all the information that you need to start building a personal asset map. So things that we can't go through your individuals, I have an example, and this is Mary's personal asset map. She's a retired educator, and she loves to teach kids to read. She's active in her service club, at the library, and in her faith community. She frequently spends time at the library, her church, and at a local bookstore. Mary's friend at church and former coworker at the school, Betty, mentioned in a recent conversation that they had over coffee at the bookstore that there were many children at the school who were struggling to read at level. A successful after-school reading program had recently been cut due to reduction in state aid. So what does Mary's asset map tell you about how she could help? Well, yep, she's got both the ability and a passion for helping kids read. And Betty, and probably many other folks in the community, know all about that. So she also works part-time at the library, and you see the other groups the places that she goes, and her groups are, she's part of the Friends of the Library and the Rotary, and she goes to a local church. So how do we leverage Mary's map? Well, remember the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, and unless you're probably around my age, you might not. But anyway, it was this game that we played. Well, Betty knew that Mary had abilities and passion. Betty used her connection with the library and bookstore to secure educational and reading materials. She then connected with her church pastor, Father Bill, who secured the church hall 3 afternoons a week. So Father Bill reached out to the parish women's group, who agreed to provide a meal. So when Mary told folks at the Rotary what she was up to, they donated funds to equip each child with school supplies. Now, let's think about how we can expand this to our entire communities. And here's an example of a very simplified community asset map. Mary probably was aware, but the local community college has student teachers who could assist. That there are other faith communities that would love to host or cook a meal. That the Chamber of Commerce could help fund e-readers for all the students. That several kids also don't get basic health care, and that the local community hospital can help. So think about how your community could do this. What assets are there in your community? How could they be connected to help build more disaster resilience? To provide solutions for everyday problems, and potentially leverage existing networks and relationships to meet the community needs in disaster. Then lastly, how do we kind of match these assets and needs? Well, it's the old Venn diagram, folks. When we've identified the assets and overlay them on the challenges, then where we see opportunities, and that's the green circle, we see opportunities that emerge. So it's about looking for the sweet spot. So again, if you have, if your assets include classroom space and retired educators, but you also have lots of kids that have few after-school programs, or going home on their own after school, then perhaps an after-school homework health program is kind of that sweet spot for you. Or maybe if you, are having, you have food insecurity in your community, and maybe amongst your assets or organizations with kitchens or relationships with or that have relationships with food banks, then perhaps it's around community dinners or feeding programs or a food pantry. So it's pretty straightforward. Again, the keys is involving the community and identifying the assets. So instead of coming in and looking for the needs, looking for the assets, and also engaging the community to self-identify what those assets are, and then working to build, good relationships among them. To first address community problems, which may or may not be disaster related. So in New Jersey, we have developed a group of affiliates called Community Organizations Active in Disaster. They're COADs, they're affiliates of New Jersey VOAD. They're located and they're serving each of our 21 counties. And what we have done is that we've purposely made them, they're not 501c3s, they're not incorporated nonprofits. They are just to provide a table for folks to come together in communities and start building these kind of networks of relationships. And oftentimes, what we see is that, if we provide these kind of things, we can overcome this particular thing that I throw here. And this is my friend. And often when I talk to community groups and nonprofits, this is absolutely the response that I receive. And I say, hey, you should be involved in your COAD, or you should be involved in BOAD if you're statewide. And this is kind of the reaction I get. So I actually know this guy. He is actually much friendlier than he looks. Just hasn't been to this class yet. But really, libraries can be information centers in a disaster. Local churches and other faith communities can be warming, cooling, and charging stations. The Lions food truck that they have to raise funds at the local fair can be pressed into service to feed disaster survivors. So this is about looking and seeing how we can build relationships that help these organizations in their everyday work, whether the focus is on, again, hunger, poverty, housing, all the many situations and needs that we see in our community, and how they can work together to fill the gaps. But then how can this be leveraged? How can these relationships build outward where statewide organizations or national organizations, both nonprofit and NGO and the government, actually start looking at filling gaps? So instead of being the lead response and recovery agents from outside the community, that we're actually empowering communities and actually just providing them with the resources they need to support the existing relationships. So we often ask our coacs when they convene, one of the things that we often say to them is ask the question, who's not at the table? And here's what we're talking about. We're talking about faith-based groups, nonprofits, service organizations, social services, your Homeland Security EMA folks, libraries, utilities, corporate partners. Corporate partners in New Jersey certainly are a big part of our engagement in doing our work in resilient communities, provide thousands of volunteers to our efforts, and are extremely important partners. Our philanthropic community, if you're not talking about or you don't have a robust relationship with your philanthropic partners, community foundations, the time to get that is not after a disaster. The time is to build that now. And of course, in New Jersey, we're, as well as most of you across the country, we have very strong educational institutions, and that's exactly what we need to be partnered with, because again, they bring many gifts, one of which is data, and help with that as well. And again, whatever group's part of the kind of discussion about who should be around the table involves kind of the nuances of your community. So, you know, if you have active groups, cultural associations, they should be at the table. Also, an important thing to consider is your access and disabled community, senior community. Make sure that these folks also have a seat at the table, who may not be a part of kind of the normal power structure. And certainly in New Jersey, where we're very culturally diverse, one of the things is to make sure that our immigrant communities and others are also represented in some way at that table. And I'd also leave one thing, and that is that we want to make sure that we have people who are actually a part of that community at the table if possible. Oftentimes, you know, we have groups that come in and say, well, I serve disabled people, or I serve, and we have made kind of an intentional attempt here in New Jersey to say, well, that's great, and we'd love to have you at the table, but can we actually have, you know, somebody that is a part of that community at the table, because it's a very different perspective. So again, this is, you know, as I told you in the beginning, it's kind of common sense, and that is that instead of trying to focus down and drill down on the problems of a neighborhood or a community, it's about looking for those asset strengths. They may be a little short on resources, but in every community, there are people who, you know, and organizations who are doing things. Oftentimes, we just found in New Jersey, as connected as we try to be, we had one county in New Jersey, as we tried to map all our feeding distribution points in this pandemic. We had one of our coacs discovered in their county that they had 87 different feeding partners that were working, and it's the first time they had all been in communication with each other, and actually some were discovering that there were places that were kind of duplicating the same services just a mile away from themselves or less. So these do become opportunities for collaboration, for cooperation, for communication, so that folks can actually do things in a more efficient way. So again, these relationships have dividends, okay, in the very small emergencies, whether they be individual or household that our organizations try to serve, but they also pay double dividends for community resilience in the face of a community-wide disaster. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our slides, and I'd love to take any questions that folks have.
Keith, right now I see one question for you. Folks, if anybody has questions, now would be the time to ask Keith. Keith, do you have any thoughts on best practices with regard to overcoming or addressing perceived microaggressions? One of our listeners asked.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that there's a way to completely avoid microaggression. I think, again, we see things from where we stand. We all have our perceptions. So depending upon what someone may say to us or what actions they may take, we certainly may perceive that as a microaggression. And I don't think that we can necessarily, I think we need to be aware as much as possible. But I think that when you go in with an approach of trying to, especially if it's culture you're not familiar with or a place that you're not familiar with, that you first employ listening, that you try to get people to tell their stories. And I think that that's one of the things that using asset-based principles works well, is because we usually start with questions. What do you do? What is it that you how do you fit in this community? What are your hopes and dreams? When we start that question kind of at a very personal level, I think that to the extent possible, that we don't see a lot of that. As opposed to us coming in and saying, well, I see you have a problem here with homelessness, so this is my recommendation. I think it's a whole different thing when we start talking about we see people as people and asking them questions. So I'm just going to use that example of homelessness. Be good if you talk to some homeless people before you started making judgments.
Amen to that. Is there a toolkit for?
Yeah, there's actually several. I don't own asset-based community development for sure. So if you go on and Google asset-based community development, you're going to actually find, I think there's 3 or 4 different sources. There's actually an asset-based community development institute that does have toolkits. Unfortunately, I don't have the link right here in front of me, but if you Google that, it should come up. There are a ton of tools out there, ranging from, again, like the ones I mentioned, appreciative inquiry. There is charrettes, which is a very interesting thing, and I don't want to go into the deep thing of that because that's a very interesting process as well. Surveys, whether it be in-person surveys, open-ended question surveys, these are all tools that can be used to support this. And there's also, actually at that Asset-Based Institute, there's actually a card game, which I actually used the last time I did this as a seminar, where people actually are able to identify assets and work through a process of how to connect to assets. So lots of good things out there. And certainly if anybody has any questions about that or can't find those, they can certainly email me directly and I'll try to hook you up.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions, and we do have the time. How do you overcome bureaucratic processes that prevent effective collaboration? Any suggestions on?
So I'm just going to say is that with all relationships, sometimes they're difficult, right? So the first thing is that to remember that we're approaching a community in a context, right? So the part of that context is whatever the government is in that particular community. So, at least on a short-term goal, it's certainly not our organization's job to go in and create a new government or to make it more amenable. That's the people's job, right? So I think that ultimately by organizing people and organizations and seeing the power in that, of connecting those assets together, then ultimately, to me, if you have government that's being an unwilling partner, by including them in the process, you almost make them willing, right? Because they're going to have to hold up their end of the bargain just like everybody else at the table. So it's not a clear, bureaucracy is going to go away, but, perhaps by including government and community groups around the table, and committing to projects to strengthen their community may help that bureaucratic or help knock down those bureaucratic walls.
Great. Since physical contact is so limited for many of us right now, do you have any suggestions for networking in the current COVID-19 environment?
Sure. So, I mean, a couple of things, and I think these are all common sense tools, and that is that I always said that and just as context is before I actually got involved in disaster response and recovery work, I actually worked kind of on the EMA side of the house for a long time, so I made a lot of plans. And I'm not here to bash plans. I think we should have good planning. But the truth is whenever disaster occurred, the biggest asset that I had was my phone. Who do I have in my phone? Who can I reach out to when I need something? Who has the knowledge that I need? Who has the resources? So I would say to all of you right now is that we're a little unconnected, but at least from the standpoint of electronics, we're still very connected. So reach out in your networks. Make sure that you're being intentional about having conversations with people and keeping those relationships alive. And if you're an organization, we have all these wonderful tools like Zoom. New Jersey VOAD up until last week was doing a weekly Zoom call with partners throughout the state just to maintain those connections.
Thank you. How do you engage local, state, or federal entities into this kind of work?
Well, so local actually is by reaching out to, that's why it's important to have that COAD network and having connections to local community organizations. So for instance, if I was to call up the mayor of Belmar and tell him I was from New Jersey VOAD and demand some of his time, I might not get it, right? Because who am I? But one of his, if the United Way, of that particular county calls him that director, he may be more amenable to that conversation because he knows who he is, and he's one of his constituents. So I think that on the local level, that's why it's important to be well connected to the as localized of an organization as you can get. And certainly in the state, here in New Jersey, we have a robust relationship with the state of New Jersey. We are included in all the disaster plans for New Jersey, and we have a seat in our State Emergency Operations Center. So those relationships, we work with all those agencies quite closely. We also work with some non-disaster agencies. For instance, our Department of Environmental Protection, we're also very interested in climate change and especially sea level rise, and we've cooperated with them quite a bit. And again, it's about, kind of coming around those common themes and then building those relationships really at the very personal level. In the federal government, of course, we have great partners here in Region 2, and we have a great state VAL and FIT team that we work with and coordinate and provide resources back and forth, which is why I'm here today.
Oh, because we have such a great relationship. So would you engage the same methods? Like, what about corporations and for-profit partners? A lot of them kind of have that, like that picture, not my problem attitude. What's the best way to go about, engaging those folks?
Well, I think that again, looking back at the whole community recovery, kind of approach, and that is that what we often forget is we kind of focus on individuals who have damage to their homes or whatever the case may be after a natural disaster. But certainly in New Jersey, our experience after Sandy was a huge economic, hit for our corporations and right down to very local businesses. So I think that part of that discussion is recognizing the impact of disaster on business community, and also realize the kind of assets that they can bring and motivations. So they're motivated to get up and, if businesses are closed, employees can't get to work, facilities are flooded out, whatever the case may be, business community has a huge